Hello and welcome to week 5 of Communication Conflict Resolution. I'm your instructor, Michael Betker. This week, we're going to tackle another round of stuff regarding power. And in particular, two articles, one you've already probably read, one you're about to read. The first is Where Does Power Come from last week, and then, of course, The Power of Talk. So here's how it shakes out for week 5, things to make and do. Obviously, start out by watching this video, which will help kind of fill in the blanks on things that you've read. There's the main article for this week, The Power of Talk, written by Deborah Tannen. Now, that article will fortify the second half of the week, in which you will then have to take a reading quiz. So this week in general, there's only two things that are due. You'll note in red down there in the lower right corner, I have changed the syllabus slightly to kind of modify, create a better pace and better flow, with this class. So thought piece number 3 normally would have been due this coming Sunday as well. On the 24th, I've actually pushed that out a week just to facilitate a better flow of assignments. So read the article Power of Talk to start with. I would say then we got a fun set of videos here that illustrate the Where Does Power Come From, and builds up to our third discussion post, which is Workplace Horror Stories. So a little fun there, I think. Everybody's got a story or two to tell there, so I'd like you to kind of candidly discuss some of the stuff you've experienced in your various work situations. So have fun with that. Obviously, we'll do that. And then I'd like you then to shift gears here, and we'll watch something a little more serious regarding gender. And Deborah Tannen kind of tackles that. I've got a couple videos that are queued up for you guys there, roughly 8 minutes apiece, that help kind of build in some more detail around the article itself, The Power of Talk. And then the last thing we'll do this week before we start next week is our reading quiz worth 25 points. And that is due on the 24th. So hopefully that's clear. Obviously, if you have any questions about what we're doing this week, shoot me an email, and I'll try to respond as quickly as possible. All right, let's move forward here. So wrapping up, we want to talk about, remember we talked about coactive versus coercive power, and we had a lot of discussion around that from our last session. This quote here from Harry Brown: the coercive power of government is always a beacon to those who want to dominate others, summoning the worst dregs of society to Washington to use that power to impose their will upon others. And often you see this coercive power being wielded in Washington. So that's kind of what he's talking about there. It really attracts all the worst sort of side of people when it comes to that. And nobody embodies that better than Frank Underwood. If you've ever seen House of Cards, it's a Netflix series. And if you have Netflix, you can easily go and watch a couple episodes and get a feel for this. But I've also curated a quick little clip for you to give you an understanding of who Frank was and kind of what he embodies. But he really is this Machiavellian character. And Machiavellian, just a quick history lesson there, was a person who, progenitor of something called the Mach scale, and it really is a 1 to 10 scale. The higher on the score there is, the more underhanded and sneaky you are, basically. So that's kind of what you see in politics, and really, honestly, if you watch House of Cards, you'll see that really portrayed, I think, very well by Kevin Spacey and others. So watch that clip, have fun with that. Let's just shift gears here and talk more about what we're going to experience most likely in our lives is just this the change that you see happening, which breeds conflict, as we know, within the organization. And this little comic here is sort of saying, what if we don't change at all and something magical just happens, right? That's really short-sighted thinking, and a lot of companies stick their head in the sand and actually just hope for the best. When in reality, the good companies are the ones that embrace change, and we'll talk more about that here in this lecture. So shift happens, as we know, right? So that's, borne out in some of the studies you've seen, or we've seen, rather, in some of the readings. But long-term longitudinal studies in numerous industries, including glass and cement manufacturing and other places, have concluded that shift does indeed happen, and innovation often involves obtaining the power and influence to overcome resistance to change. So in other words, people come in a lot of times as change agents into various organizations to create change, and to, essentially a lot of times it means heads are going to get cut, or people are going to lose their jobs, or changes are going to happen that are not going to be in the short term pleasant in some cases. Now, some cases they're pleasant, but in most cases you see people coming in with the name hacksaw. So the most successful firms maintain a workable equilibrium for several years, but are also able to initiate sharp, widespread changes when their environments shift. So really, you just got to embrace the change. The example I would use is Anybody who thinks a forest fire is bad for nature needs to rethink that. If you do any digging, you realize forest fires are actually necessary to, relieve the soil of dead wood, and it's just a rebirth sort of process that we also go through organizationally and frankly in our own lives, our personal lives as well. But change does happen, and so those are agencies and organizations that embrace change are those that are going to survive long term. So where does power come from? And really, this article actually talks about two places. It's the formal piece and the personal piece. And there's personal characteristics and situational factors that are really the primary two factors. So power really is described as the capacity for A, in other words, let's say you have a boss and your job, to influence you. So he's A, you're B, your behavior, so that B does things, you do things that you would not otherwise do. For example, stay late and get that report done, or drive somebody to the airport even though you don't have the time to do that kind of thing. So either way, that's a good example of how power gets wielded. On the right-hand column here, you've got both formal and personal examples. On the left-hand side, coercive, reward, and legitimate power, stuff we talked about last week, make up formal power, and the personal power is more expert power. In other words, I have expertise in a section or a piece of the business that I can actually weigh in on better than anybody else. Or something called referent power, and we used the J.J. Watt example last week. Referent power is really star power or charisma. So two sides of it, right? So you get personal power, instructional, situational power. And personal power is obviously just your own, the effect you have on people when you come into an organization. And there's some more on that in the coming slides here. But on the right-hand side, structural, situational power, and we've talked about that already, but that's essentially, again, just your position and place in the organization. So very interesting when you come to an organization and you meet people for the first time. People don't tend to look past you as a person. So this is really a point in time when charisma and your first affectations of people are really strongly felt, most strongly felt. That's so true. When you start a job, obviously, it's less about the structure of things. It's more about your personal charisma and your ability to make connections with people in the organization. Even when we know that the behavior people exhibit is strongly affected by situational factors, we readily make attributions and evaluations about others based on that behavior and over-attribute power to personal characteristics. So if you come in with a certain thought and you have a certain look, let's say you're pretty sharply dressed and you're pretty confident and you exhibit some charisma, people invariably will start thinking, gosh, this person's really got the tiger by the tail, and will have a short sort of windfall of sorts with personal power. So that is a good example of charisma. And if you look through history, here on the right-hand side, you see some pictures of some folks. Gandhi, of course. Bono is one more recently. You see who has done quite a bit of things in the public eye beyond his music. Of course, John Lennon and others. You got MLK and just a bevy of people who really have charisma. And how that's defined in the article is it's an endowment with the gift of divine grace. So these leaders obviously demonstrate an ability to lead lots of people in times of crisis. So we'll get some examples here. One of my favorite examples coming up here is Winston Churchill. But charismatic leaders create emotional bonds with others rather than purely instrumental. So it's, through thick and thin, no matter what happens, you're able to cultivate this relationship that allows people to kind of follow you along and create change. So I mentioned Churchill here. I love this story. If you want to watch a movie, I know I've told you before I'm a movie person, but most recently I watched Churchill, basically just called Churchill, and it starred, I think, Johnny Depp as Churchill, and he did a really wonderful job. And it's a small section of time there where they go through kind of the period of time when England was really the last stop for Hitler and his armies, and they held out through grit and determination, but not without the help and the strong help of Winston Churchill, who said, if you have enemies, good. That means you've stood up for something in your life. And if you watch the movie, if you learn about his life, you realize he had a lot of opposition throughout his career in Parliament, where he did not have a lot of friends there. And he had a very hard-line sort of approach to things, and obviously said things like, never, never, never give up. And also, if you're going through hell, keep going. One of my all-time favorite quotes. Just keep going, man. So that's charisma, a good example, I think, of that. And that is something we can wield personally as well within our own lives. So kind of putting some nuts and bolts to this, personal traits characterizing effective political actors. So in other words, some things that you might have found with Churchill and other good leaders. People invariably will say the following things. They're articulate, they're sensitive, they're socially adept, they're competent, they're popular. All of these things obviously build up to this idea of charisma, and that's what people look for. So kind of a neat little thing there. Now, conversely, if you look at personal power gone awry, I would say this is more of a humorous sort of take on that. Someone like Dwight Schrute, who is invariably always looking to grab power at every turn, and it's obvious to everyone, including his boss, Michael Scott. So enjoy that clip there. It's a very short one, but if you haven't seen the show, you might get hooked by this little clip here. But Dwight Schrute is my favorite character on the show, and for a lot of reasons. He's just embodies this, the opposite of charisma, I would say, in every case. He's just over the top, and his personality is such that he will never probably achieve any power based on the way he handles himself. Something called fundamental attribution error. I want to talk about that. So essentially what that means, and if you ever drew this clip here, this picture, shows it. I experience this quite often. I kind of catch myself when I do it, but whenever you see somebody driving, like just yesterday, I had somebody cut me off. I laid on the horn just to let them know. And I was a little upset, a little perturbed, but then I said, oh, that probably just, I've done that too, right? So I quickly empathized with that person and was not mad. Some people, on the other hand, kind of have more of an angry result. And you get what's called road rage sometimes when bad things happen. Now, sometimes people are just jerks when they drive, and that's a different story. But a lot of times we make these hyper leaps in at what's called fundamental attribution error. So essentially, it's a tendency to overemphasize the causal importance of people and their characteristics and to underemphasize the importance of situational factors. So in other words, you make up all these sort of crazy thoughts about, look at the top end here, or the bottom end, rather. This positional attribution says crazy driver. That's what they're doing. They're just crazy. Versus maybe the driver's ill. So that's thinking maybe more positively. Okay, that's probably what's going on there. On the bottom hand again, of course, unfavorable reaction. Speed up and race past one another, driving, craning to give a dirty look. And now I've done that. I'll be honest, I've done that before. Or course, the tolerant reaction, which I've tried to cultivate, and more I'm able to do that. That's to proceed cautiously, allowing the driver a wide berth. So again, it just comes down to your perception, and perception is reality. Now, there's this thing called Occam's razor, which is not anywhere in your text or anything else, but I want to share that with you. It's the simplest solution is often the best. So really, is it because this person has some sort of secret vendetta against you, or is it just because this person maybe is not paying attention, or maybe they're sick, maybe they're drunk? Either way, giving wide berth is probably the best rule of thumb there, and it's not some conspiracy that you may have cooked up in your brain. So that's fundamental attribution error. All right, so breaking down situational sources of power, they often result from being in the right place at the right time, by being in a position of authority. Obviously, if you ever watch Game of Thrones, it's all about power and authority in every situation. It's all about who's the hand of the king and who has been born into authority. So essentially, that's what happens a lot of times. Is you're being in the position of authority already. By being in a position to resolve uncertainty is another example of that, and by being in a position to broker among various subunits and external factors. So power goes up and down the spectrum there, but the main point here is people are rarely randomly assigned to their situations. It's often just something that they're born into or given. Another humorous clip here. Sorry, I'm full of these this week here, but another one of my all-time favorite movies is Office Space. It's a little old, but it's certainly still, I would say, very much a great satire about what it's like to work in corporate America. And this scene here you're going to see is really related to change. And like we talked about in the beginning, companies come in to ask to look under the hood of a company to see what's going on from a productivity standpoint. And this is one person here they have in their sights. So it's a humorous sort of look at that, but it's sort of asking tough questions about how that person's day goes and how they work within their position and how they manage resources. So enjoy that little clip. Situational sources of power. So I'll just read this here. Consider the power sometimes held by purchasing agents. So I've had this experience. in my past, purchasing agents do have a lot of power, and they often stand between others in the organization and can hold up projects, frankly, with their step in the process. And oftentimes, companies force or require that you run your purchasing through these purchase people, these agencies, or these agents rather. So, thinking about that, obviously that's power, right? That's the ability to kind of hold back what's going on. So some were able to leverage their intermediary position at the expense of departments with greater formal status and authority. So really, even though you're not the highest in order of importance or power, if you're a part of the purchasing department, you can actually hold sway and hold things up if you wish. And sometimes that does happen, believe it or not. So sometimes it's just, you don't have to be the top dog necessarily to kind of create power and you wield power within organizations. Situational power and failure. So people are seldom randomly assigned to positions or situations as we've discussed. And here's the dark side of that. Now, I've had this happen to me before. I had a boss I didn't get along that great with, and she set me up in positions that she thought I would fail. Now, I overachieved there and was able to do well in any position or anything she gave me, so that didn't work really to her plan. Now, but know this, that obviously you can be given a job to put you outside your comfort zone in some cases, and that's on purpose, and some companies will do that. So external factors often have a direct bearing on the sources of failure of an individual, and yet many studies of power fail to take account of such factors. So it's one of those things that's not often talked about. But I can tell you from experience that you can be set up to fail. No joke. The example we talked about here, and this is obviously not, there's no nefarious thing going on here necessarily, but in the story you guys have kind of written about now already about the school superintendent who was promoted to head department of education. Now, in her role as the school superintendent, she was very successful, right? She was able to create relationships and really thrived in that position. But when she got promoted, she was promoted outside of her comfort zone, and the same sort of tactics she used when she was school superintendent at the new position, more broader governmental position, she was not able to have as much success. In fact, she found a lot of failure. So situational wrecks and personal traits. Building off of what we discussed here in the previous slide, where we talked about the school superintendent promotion, an important source of power is the match between style, skill, and capacities of what is required of the situation. So obviously in this case here, we had a little bit of a fail. So in a study of influence at a research and development laboratory, 304 professionals were asked about influence in their organization. And really what came out of that are really three types, depending on the nature of the project. So the first one is internal communication style, and that's folks who just have a finger on the pulse of the organization and what's going on. Kind of like if you watch MASH, you'll know who Klinger is. Klinger was one of those folks who really knew how to get things done internally. External communication style, external information. So folks, like using an example from my career, I've often worked with agencies or as an agency member, but either way, they come from the outside oftentimes to work with a client, and they bring in external information into the fold, and so they bring new information a lot of times that they didn't expect before. So that's external communication stars, and of course, then the boundary spanners. Just what it sounds like. Spanner means crossing the bridge between the two of these, so it's linked to both and it's applied to research. So boundary spanners can really take the best of both and apply their knowledge in a meaningful way. So boundary spanners are very important if you can find those in your organization. Last slide in this section, and we'll take a break. Reagan versus LBJ, this is a good example. If you flip-flop these two guys, and you put, let's say, Ronald Reagan in the time of LBJ in the role of president there, and you put Lyndon Johnson in Ronald Reagan's role, the great communicator, you would find that they both would fail. And that's largely because of the timing given. So when Reagan was president, that was the birth, obviously, you see in a big way, the media played a bigger role. And Ronald Reagan, his background, as you know, was an actor. So he was really trained to deliver messages in a meaningful way. And he's also a big, did a lot of advertising and hawked a lot of products and stuff like that. So he was really good at communication, basically. LBJ, conversely, was not found in front of the camera because, frankly, there wasn't much of that going on at that time. But he was much better interpersonally. So you got this great communicator who can create, a groundswell of support and interest, nationally versus the behind-the-scenes guy in LBJ who was able to use old style politics and able to go and make deals in back rooms essentially, versus what Reagan was, which was really, like I said, the great communicator. Takeaway: neither would have been elected president if they were put in the other's time. So that was kind of one of the things that they talked about in the article. All right, we're going to take a little break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the power of talk from Deborah Tannen. So I would say, if you haven't done so already, take a quick glance at that, maybe read that through before we go through this lecture here.